I like your confidence.
So it's called in the business fresh legs coming in. Democracy School is a whirlwind. You could spend half a day on Dillon's Rule. You could spend 2 days on corporate rights, what we give you during the time that we have you. And the Democracy School used to be 3 days, so count your blessings. So a whole nother day in addition to what you guys have gone through already. The job at the end is to give you a taste of what's happening with activism that's rooted in Democracy School principles. And to explain to you where it's happening, what it looks like, most of this is very brief and very quick. You have an outline on page 273 of your materials. We're not going to go through that in any detail. I'm just going to carve out some of the generalities. And I'm going to start with last night, where we left off in 2000-2001. So just a reminder, a couple hundred factory hog farms coming into south central Pennsylvania, and communities that didn't want those factory farms operating there, who had passed regulatory laws dealing with liquid manure from the factory farms that were coming in. Those liquid manure laws were then overridden by the state, so the agribusiness corporations went to the state of Pennsylvania and wrote a bill called the Nutrient Management Act, which you guys covered with the regulatory triangle, and I talked briefly about last night, as a preemptive mechanism to take those communities out, those regulatory laws out. The folks in Pennsylvania had a choice. At that point, they could either go home and say, we tried, we passed those regulatory laws, the corporations outfoxed us, they passed the thing at the state level, now we just have to live with the factory farms. Or they could have chosen a different path, which was to do something quite different, which was to begin to challenge these basic doctrines. Which way is the box? To begin to challenge some of this stuff, because they were at a point where they were saying to themselves, look, we can't stop these corporate factory farms from coming in unless we actually begin to challenge the basic doctrine of preemption. In other words, that the state doesn't have control over what we do, or full extent of control over what we do. And so those communities came to us as we were beginning to shut down our law office and doing something else. And the community said, we want to stop them. We don't want them here. We have communities made up of farmers, our elected officials are farmers, we understand what this corporate farming stuff is, and we want to say no to these factory farms coming in. To which we said again, you can't, because preemption has been used. It's a legal doctrine, it's a recognized doctrine, it's well-settled law. The state can come in and tell you to do whatever the hell they want you to do because you're a creature of the state, and they can pass preemptive laws to overturn whatever you pass legislatively. To which those elected officials basically came to us en masse and said something I always remember to today, which is, we don't care. We don't care if we get sued. That's okay. We don't care if we run up against these doctrines. That's okay. Because the choice on the other side is unacceptable. It's not acceptable for us to receive the factory farms, and we're going to fight and do whatever we can, including challenging some of these doctrinal stuff, to stop them from coming in. And so what you had in south central Pennsylvania was communities, with our help, beginning to draft these things called anti-corporate farming laws. And these were mentioned briefly before as you guys were talking about some of the Commerce Clause stuff. These anti-corporate farming laws, which were not invented in south central Pennsylvania, actually came out of the Midwest. So states like South Dakota and Nebraska, who had passed statewide anti-corporate farming laws previously. Basically, people in those states, farmers, environmental organizations, different folks coming together saying the problem here is not smell from the factory farms. The problem is not liquid manure being produced by those factory operations. The problem is that we have this corporatization of agriculture that's occurring. There's a deeper problem here. The factory farms are really just a symptom. They're a symptom of a loss of control over the farming system that's been passed on to a very small number of corporations. 4 corporations control 70% of pork production in the United States today. 4 corporations control about 80% of poultry production in the US. And 1 corporation, Kraft, controls 60% of cheese production in the United States. So you have this corporatization, this real centralization of power and economics within a very small number of corporations. And so what folks in the Midwest did were they began to pass these anti-corporate farming laws, which banned corporations from engaging in farming in those states, except for family farm corporations. Family farmers use corporations for liability purposes and intergenerational passing of the farms, those types of things. So it doesn't ban family farming or corporations that family farmers use to do those things, but actually attack those bigger mega corporations that are putting in the factory farms and doing the structural stuff. Those laws in the Midwest have an interesting history. We won't talk at length about them, but suffice it to say that folks in those states, it was not the legislature passing those laws. It was people driving them as initiatives through the state government with the opposition of Democrats and Republicans and the institutions that were in those states. Not content with just passing them as statutes, they actually drove them into the state constitution in South Dakota. So imagine that. An amendment to the state constitution banning corporations from farming within the state. Okay, so that's the type of thing that started to happen in the Midwest. What we did was we helped folks in South Central Pennsylvania to take those constitutional amendments and those laws and rework them into anti-corporate farming laws at the local level, so at the municipal level. And when we started talking to these folks about what would happen when they passed these, and we said, well, you're going to get sued and you're going to go through this process, and what's the point? If you're going to pass these laws and you're going to start to challenge these doctrines, what's the point? Because somebody's going to drag you into court and the judge is going to say you can't do this, and then they're going to overturn the law. And so that was our question as lawyers, wearing the lawyer hat, saying, what's the point of doing this? To which, again, the comment that came back from the elected officials was, we think that if we do it in one little place, that someone else will do it. And when someone else does it, maybe somebody else will do it, and maybe then we'll have 10 or 20 or 30 of these communities doing it, and eventually we'll begin to have a base of power that starts to push to start changing how some of these doctrines are interpreted. To which we said back to them, generally, fat chance. That's not how the system works. In fact, the corporate boys are good at cutting you apart. Instead of taking you on completely, they just splice you off and then take you down individually. But when we talk about the civil rights movement, we talk about the 4 African-American kids that sat down at Woolworths, right? You could ask them the same question. What's the point? You're breaking a criminal ordinance. They're just going to come in, they're going to haul you away. Nothing's going to change the next day. Not going to get served lunch, right? And they would have said probably the same thing, which is, if we do it, maybe somebody else does it. That's what movements are about. The next week after the first Woolworth sit-ins occurred, there were 200 sit-ins, right? And a week after that, there were 500 sit-ins, right? So this is not necessarily about being silver-tongued lawyers or coming up with the fancy legal strategies or doctrines. It's about force, right? It's about different people in different places coming together that force the change, not to try to split hairs and argue certain legal theories against X, Y, and Z, because those have pretty much been exhausted over the past 150 years anyway. So what happened in South Central Pennsylvania is these communities were passing these anti-corporate farming laws. Well, the corporations, Smithfield Foods and Hatfield Foods Corporation, began taking a look at the laws that were being passed, and most of them began to pull out. They said, we're not going to put factory farms there. We don't want to get involved in a $100,000, $200,000 legal fight in these communities to try to overturn these laws and force ourselves in. They, of course, went next door to other communities that didn't have the anti-corporate farming laws in place and put in factory farms there. The interesting thing that happened next is that it started to morph past an issue area, a specific issue area of corporate farming, to something called the land application of sewage sludge. I'm not going to get into sewage sludge at length.
We did last night.
Right, okay, we're already into sewage sludge. That the program, of course, current contemporary treatment of sludge is to ship it from the centralized sewage treatment plants off to farmers to use as a replacement for chemical fertilizer. The stream of sewage sludge that comes out of those centralized sewage treatment plants can contain up to 100,000 contaminants. We've had kids die in different places from being exposed to it. In Pennsylvania, it's become a huge issue, as with other states. We had communities contacting us about the anti-corporate farming law, saying, well, can we actually transition that into an anti-corporate sludging law? Because guess what? 3 corporations control 80% of sludge hauling in the United States. Those are the folks getting paid municipal dollars to haul the sludge away to farmers to try to give it for free to those farmers on the back end. So we developed an anti-corporate sludging ordinance and put it into Pennsylvania. First one municipality passed it, then 10, then 20, then 30, then 50, then we were up to 86 in Pennsylvania, 86 small township governments. Between those and the anti-corporate farming laws, we were up to about 100 communities in Pennsylvania, which is about 10% of all rural township governments in the state of Pennsylvania. So just to give you an idea of the mass that started to be reached. As everybody knows, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And generally, when you're dealing with the corporate folks, the reaction is not equal at all, but very unequal. And so the response by the corporate boys was to sue one of the townships. The lawsuit, which was brought by one of the major agribusiness corporations, said that the anti-corporate farming laws were unconstitutional because they treated family farmers differently from corporate farmers. And that was a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the U.S. Constitution. Because corporations have equal protection rights under the 14th Amendment, which you guys learned about ad nauseum today, and that the corporations were claiming that their corporate 14th Amendment equal protection rights have been violated. That was the content of the lawsuit. As soon as the lawsuit came in, the supervisors, the elected officials, started faxing it all over Pennsylvania. It was the internet of the day back then, so faxing it all over to the different township offices, saying, oh my God, these corporate rights are an issue, that corporations have constitutional rights. We had been trying to explain that to people for 5-7 years, that this was something that they needed to care about, to which they would say uniformly, we don't need to care about that. It's something you learn in law school or college or some other place, but we live in a democracy. And because we live in a democracy, what we pass sticks, right? We have the power to pass law, and we're going to make that law stick, and we don't need to bother with the corporate rights stuff. Well, the lawsuit comes in the door, and page 1 is corporations. We are a corporation. We are the plaintiff. We are a person under the law. You have violated our corporate 14th Amendment equal protection rights under the law because your law discriminates against corporate farmers, right? That was the claim. To which the elected officials that we've been working with, which were about 100 to 200 individuals at that point, said, now we understand how corporate rights fit. It's not an abstract thing just floating around out there. Corporation has this right, First Amendment rights, and Fourth Amendment rights, and Fifth Amendment rights. That's where the rubber hits the road, is when it's used, it's applied, right? And that was a very specific practical case of it being applied. You can't tell people this stuff, right? It's very hard for people to understand it in an activist sense until they're actually hit with it in the face, right? And that was being hit with it in the face. So what happened next? Well, 2 townships on the other side of the state, so folks familiar with Pennsylvania, over near Pittsburgh, because most of this was happening in south central Pennsylvania, 2 communities over there said, well, wait a minute, we don't think corporate rights are democratic, right? Because if we can't pass a law without having a challenge from corporations coming and using those corporate rights to overturn our ordinance, then that's not really a democratic process that we live in. And we responded to them, well, yeah, but what do you want to do about it? And they said, well, we want to remove corporate rights from corporations that do business within our municipality, right? And we said, well, you can't do that, right? We put our lawyer hat on it. You can't do that. The U.S. Supreme Court has said corporations are persons. You can't do that. What's the point of doing that, right? And they said, well, maybe if we do it, somebody else will do it, and then maybe there'll be a couple more that do it, and maybe eventually at some point this stuff will change, right? And force change. And again, we said, that chance, but we'll help you anyway. They became the first municipalities to draft an anti-corporate rights ordinance, which actually removed corporate constitutional rights from corporations operating within those townships. First in the country. Porter and Licking townships in a little place called Clarion County. Just to reference stuff in your book, you have a couple newspaper articles about what happened there on page 289. And you actually have the actual ordinance on page 285. And then the lawsuit on page 281. So again, we're flipping through this stuff pretty quickly, but that's some base materials that you guys have. And so Licking and Porter townships, the elected officials said, we're going to pass this. We said, we don't think you have the cojones to do that, but we're going to help you anyway. And lo and behold, they passed it unanimously. Became the first municipalities in the United States to actually declare the corporations in a binding fashion, binding law at the local level. The corporations don't have certain rights within those municipalities. What happened next? Well, what you'll find with this work, if you become involved in it, actually doing the day-to-day activist stuff that revolves around the democracy school, is that it's like a chess game. Somebody moves a piece, another piece is moved. In this case, the piece that got moved next was that the corporations went to the state legislature. And they drafted a bill called Agriculture, Communities, and Rural Environment, which, just to pause a second, because it's a good one, the state legislature authorized the Attorney General's office to serve as a private attorney for the corporations who were running up against these ordinances in their localities. So the way the law stands today, as it did when the law was passed, is that if you're a private company like Smithfield Foods and you run up against one of these ordinances, you can pick up the phone and call the Attorney General's office, and they will appoint a Deputy Attorney General to you specially to act as your private lawyer to sue the municipal governments to overturn the ordinances that they've passed. Right?
And how could they do that?
How could they not? Right? Signed into law by a Democratic governor, Ed Rendell.
They made it a law that you can do that?
Yes, so ACRE exists in Pennsylvania. It was borrowed from a New York law, which also deals with factory farm operations the same way, allows the Attorney General to come in and actually overturn laws. It created a firestorm in Pennsylvania because as much as Republicans talk about local control, they don't believe in local control when it actually results in actual local control. People doing stuff that they don't agree with. And so the Attorney General's office started dispatching people into these municipalities to threaten their municipalities, their municipal elected officials, that if they didn't overturn or repeal the local laws, that they were going to get sued by the state. So again, not the corporation suing the municipality, but the state itself. So you living in Pennsylvania, paying tax dollars to the Attorney General's office, which is a publicly supported office, and them being used as private attorneys to come in at the behest of the corporations to sue the municipality with your money, your tax dollars. Right, that's ACRE. Yeah. So that's ACRE. So when you start to push the buttons, Kai talked about this earlier, when you start to push the buttons, it all starts to come down.
So can I come in as a private citizen and say, state, you are doing an illegal taking of my taxes?
You can try that.
The takings, or you're a small farm. Let's say you're a small farm.
Right.
You're doing an illegal taking to advantage my company.
Yep, a lot of those remedies have been tried, unfortunately, over the past 50 years in different scenarios. Haven't worked, but, free to do that. And so the situation in Pennsylvania got pretty fierce. So you had these attorney generals, state deputy attorney generals coming in to threaten the municipalities. You had the municipalities starting to fight back. You had a situation where a deputy attorney general came into a small municipality, made a speech about, you don't repeal your law, we're going to sue you. He was physically escorted out of the building by the women who were part of the organization there. That made the front page of the Capitol newspaper because the photographer was there taking a picture of the guy getting escorted out. They basically said, hey, we got things handled here, you go back to the Capitol, we don't need you. And the next day they were sued by the state, so the state attorney general sued them. Next door, a little place called Packer Township, the elected officials passed a law suspending the authority of the attorney general to enforce anti-democratic laws within their municipality. And so things got pretty hot in Pennsylvania around that ACRE stuff. Stuff is pretty hot there now, especially after the city of Pittsburgh passed a law banning fracking oil and gas extraction within the city of Pittsburgh. And so the work has spread within Pennsylvania that way. In addition to Licking and Porter, something interesting that you guys have probably talked about while I wasn't here over the last 20-some hours, but the rights of nature. That environmental protection in the United States has always been based on ecosystems being property. Basically, if you own a 10-acre piece of property, it carries with it the legal authority to destroy the ecosystems on that piece of property, as long as there's no wetland or endangered species or some kind of special condition for that property. That community known as Tamaqua Borough, over near the city of Philadelphia, so still in the rural area above Philly, northwest of Philadelphia, became the first community to recognize that nature has rights. That ecosystems are not property, but that ecosystems have a right to exist and flourish, and that people in the community can actually step into the shoes of those ecosystems to defend those ecosystems within those communities. So this huge new paradigm shifting concept about cutting edge environmental protection stuff emerged out of this 12,000 person municipality in rural Pennsylvania. And has since traveled to about 36 different municipalities, including the country of Ecuador, where we were asked to come in and advise the Constitutional Commission for the country of Ecuador as they put rights of nature into their national constitution, which happened back in 2008. And now we have lawsuits that have commenced underneath those rights of nature provisions. And again, we're just touching things really quickly here, but that's something else that started to happen as people started to begin to treat their own municipalities as lawmaking authority, real lawmaking authority, about what do we do here with rights and what do we pass. So the initial laws that were passed in Pennsylvania have evolved. They've gotten much more complicated. You have a copy of an early law in 273, and the appendix basically, page 307 has a more extended type of law. The Bill of Rights for Spokane is on page 301. Just some examples of how the laws have expanded. And just to give the Cliff Note version of what the laws look like now.
Did that ever go through?
Which one?
Community Bill of Rights for Spokane?
No.
No. Here's a better one.
Yeah. So before I draw this, it's important to understand that what you're seeing, I think, in these places, and why it's become known as the community rights movement, is a revolt. It's a revolt against this structure of law that you guys have just spent the last 9 hours talking about. This type of revolt doesn't happen until people begin to understand how the system is set up. Most people in the United States have no clue what the system looks like under which they live, right? It's a myth that people are well informed and people understand how the system operates. Most people don't understand how the system operates until they confront it, until they come face to face with it, smacks them in the head. Last night I said something that probably didn't make too much sense, which was when you're in a community that has a factory farm coming in or some other project, you don't hit the corporation first. The corporation is not what you hit first. What you hit is the structure of law first, because it begins to define. In fact, it's the 8th inning before you, by the time you get there, because it's already been defined for you, it defines what you can do. That's why we call it the box of allowable remedies. A revolt big enough to actually begin to change the structure, to do systemic change, has to start with enough people understanding how the system works in order to take the steps to dismantle it, right? That's what democracy school is intended to be. The main stem of it is just to explain how we got to this place, explain how the law works, because there's such a small sliver of people in the United States who actually understand how the system works. And without that base, you can't actually take steps to fix it. So communities that are beginning to fix it, beginning to change the structure, are passing laws that look much different than laws that you will normally see adopted at the municipal level. You know, normally municipal laws will be like, you know, weed nuisance laws, you know, where neighbors can't, you know, grow certain height weeds in their yards. I mean, basic nuisance stuff and land use and zoning stuff. These ordinances are much different. At their base and in the middle is a Bill of Rights. So we're used to talking about state bills of rights, and we're used to talking about the federal Bill of Rights. This is about getting our brains around a concept of a local Bill of Rights. And here in Spokane, it might be easier because there's been several on the ballot, so people have talked about that a little bit. The Bill of Rights is usually coupled with a set of prohibitions. So in Pittsburgh, for example, the Bill of Rights passed in the city of Pittsburgh said, we have a right to a sustainable energy future, and because of that, we're going to prohibit fracking within this community. In other words, the right is the flip side of the prohibition. So we have a right to sustainable farming, which means that we're going to prohibit corporate factory farming within the community. So rights paired with prohibition. And then the ordinance take on the doctrines. So there's a piece of the ordinances that directly contests preemption. There's another piece that directly contests corporate rights. There's another piece that directly contests Dillon's rule. And in some places, there's a rights of nature provision which says that ecosystems and nature within the community have rights and are not property. The concept is, and has been since the early evolution of these ordinances, to actually build a torpedo. Actually build a structure. We used to refer to it as tar baby, but we don't anymore for obvious reasons. To build something that you can stick your hand into, but you won't get it out, right? To build these war zones, these battle situations, in which you're scripting a confrontation between the corporation and the community. You're scripting a confrontation between the community and the corporation in which it creates an organizing model. It's not necessarily about a legal theory, although we have that as well, and when we go into courts, we try to win it on that legal theory. But it's about building a machine so that when the corporation comes in to challenge the ordinance, they actually have to validate each of these theories in real time in front of the people that have passed the law in the community in the first place. Okay? So again, part of the struggle here is understanding these theories enough to actually go after them. But what you want in the courts, when you draw that confrontation between the community and the court, is to build a structure in which you're forcing the court staff to come in and validate each of these things. It's my theory, my understanding, my opinion, enough of these get built around the country, and we have about 300 of these built, but there needs to be about 10,000 for anything to actually happen on a bigger level. That it's this penetration, it's these challenges, these contests that actually give birth to a radicalized community. In other words, a community that comes to grips with the fact that these, not only do these exist, but that's how these are used, and picking a fight with the corporation that comes in. Because it's only through this contest, and again, there are several permutations of this, we're running through this pretty quickly, but this is the basic model. So when communities ask us to come in and help, usually they're done with the regulatory process. They've come to an understanding that the regulatory process may give them a better frac well, but is not going to stop the frac well. It's going to give them a better factory farm, but not stop the factory farm. That unless they assert their local lawmaking authority and actually make a stand and pick a fight in a scripted way, that they're going to be lost. That there is zero chance of actually stopping that particular facility from coming in. So the ordinances, the charter amendments, the various instruments of law are generally drafted that way at the community level to create that contest. And then the concept is that communities across the United States who have now come together through this community rights stuff, in other words, come to grips with what the law is and the understanding that they need to challenge it for them to have any ability whatsoever to determine the fate of that community, that these folks have now joined in things called state community rights networks. And Washington has a community rights network to propose state constitutional amendments, with those state amendments actually legalizing this lawmaking. So in some ways, state amendments that actually explicitly authorize municipalities and people within those municipalities to do a certain kind of lawmaking. So these state amendments, the way that they look, is that they're actually the state authorizing municipalities and communities to adopt laws that contain Bill of Rights provisions and that contain prohibitions that actually carry out those Bill of Rights protections at the local level, and the authority to redefine corporate rights and to be immune from preemption of a certain kind at the state level. So in other words, state amendments attempting to protect local lawmaking authority from those higher levels of law being able to overturn those laws. And then these community rights networks at the state level have come together to form the National Community Rights Network, which has drafted a 28th Amendment to the Constitution, which is about recognizing a right of local self-government similar to what the state amendments have put into play. And I know that's like drinking from a fire hose, but that's usually where we end up on Sunday afternoon. So this is what's happening in the US right now, that you have this ferment at the bottom, and Spokane has been one of those places doing the fermenting, which is proposing Bill of Rights for the city of Spokane through the initiative process. So people in Spokane coming together through a group called Envision Spokane to actually drive this model within the city for the Bill of Rights, and then accumulating in different states, because we now have 5 state community rights networks up to this level to do the state work, which reflects the democracy school stuff, and then driving into the national level to do the national change that needs to take place. So that in a nutshell is what the national, state, and local organizing looks like.
So it's because these municipalities wouldn't back down that the state is supporting them.
Correct. Yes, which is helpful in a way. I mean, just to pause for a moment, because people in Pennsylvania came to us and said, oh, we're really sorry that ACRE has been passed, the state law, which gives corporations the Attorney General to use the smack them down. To which we saw it actually as a good thing. Because a lot of people think that the problem is the corporation. The problem is the corporate entity itself. But the problem is much larger than that. The corporation can't do what it wants to do to the community unless it's empowered by this system of law, right? So it's not a corporate problem. What we have is a government problem. It's a state problem. Because the corporation can't do what it wants to do unless it's bestowed with certain rights. So the way I always look at it is the corporation, the state protections and the law, like preemption and Dillon's rule and all that stuff, it's like a boxing glove. Corporation comes in, puts on the boxing glove, and then beats the shit out of the community. But it takes both to tango. It's not just the corporation, because the corporation by itself doesn't have those rights inherently or naturally. It's been given those rights. And so it's a nasty combination of those two that come together to pummel the communities. And so the problem framing doesn't take place because we go out and say to people, it's not corporations that are the problem, it's the state. The problem framing happens when the state acts and proves what we're saying is true. Because otherwise people can't hear it. It bounces off them because it goes contrary to what we've all learned in our own democracy schools, kindergarten, elementary school, high school, civics class, everything else. So you're running counter to all that. And you can't get there with people unless they see it happening in front of them on an issue that they care about. And so when the Attorney General comes in, every time they come in to sue a community, that's a good thing. As tough as it is sometimes to say that, it's a good thing. Because people in the community are watching firsthand in real time this process playing out. And that's the only thing that, at least in my opinion, has worked for people to actually radicalize themselves to come to a point where they understand the need for structural or system change.
Do you think the election has also sort of galvanized or energized this process, or what effect does it have in this process?
I think it has its good points and its bad points. And one of the bad points is that you hear a lot of people saying, well, we need to hold the line from the Obama years. We need to hold the line, right? Well, there wasn't much line to hold at that point. I mean, we had somebody that shared, at least speaking personally, somebody that shared my values, progressive stuff in healthcare and that kind of stuff. But at the same time, this power structure has remained untouched, literally. And now, those who put in their lot with federal power are now dying by federal power. What I mean by that is, when you don't take the time to build in those different checks and balances at the municipal level, that now you have someone using federal power for bad, and there's nothing to stop it. So these sanctuary cities, for example, the sanctuary cities are a perfect example of entities that need to be building a separate right of local self-government in those municipalities to say you can't preempt us when we pass sanctuary laws, right? There needs to be a legal doctrine developed to actually uphold the sanctuary cities, but there's nothing.
So in the 8 years of the Obama administration, nothing really changed in this construct?
Structurally, no. What you got was a higher power, the federal government, which began operating under different values. You know, our values, my values, whatever you want to call them. And what you've done is you changed out the top part, but the structural stuff has not changed. There's been no change in the rights that municipalities have or the rights that people within those communities have.
How do the sanctuary cities establishing themselves as sanctuary cities differ from putting in an ordinance that says you won't put a factory farm here?
It doesn't. It's exactly the same.
Okay.
But the sanctuary cities are not defending themselves on the basis that they have an inherent right to do that. They're trying to find loopholes in the law to uphold them, which is a dead-end game. So our frustration is that when this stuff gets defended, or that when the Democrats work on resistance to the Trump agenda, that it's got to go into the structural stuff. It actually has to begin to focus on changing the structural stuff at the local federal interface. It can't just be on the surface kind of stuff.
And specifically to the sanctuary example, right now, if you see communities passing anything remotely akin to a law, it's merely about restricting their own law enforcement from being involved in detainment and deportation. So it's a limit on one element of the government, it has nothing to do with rights. Now, where does that power come from? Well, it's the states allowing that capability to exist. So you have states like Arizona, for instance, that disallow any sort of communities from having that ability of their local law enforcement to not participate in detainment and deportation. In fact, there was just an instance where people tried to push that forward, and the city council said, well, I'm sorry, but state law says we can't put a law in place that says we can restrict the involvement of local law enforcement to be involved in detainment and deportation.
So through your plot plan, how would you construct a sanctuary city?
We actually have a template ordinance that goes at it from the basis of rights. So it's a whole community bill of rights that's saying people have certain fundamental rights, and that it's the right of the community, because it has the right of self-government, to actually protect those fundamental rights of human beings. So it comes at it from a rights standpoint. It also attacks all those other legal doctrines. And it goes much further than any of the other laws out there, because it also says no government should be able to violate basic fundamental human rights. Not just about restricting law enforcement, but state or federal government should not be allowed to come into a community to detain and deport people based solely on their immigration status. So it's about taking the fight to a true sanctuary type level, which in my opinion, the only entities out there that are really talking about it are the churches. They're willing to actually physically harbor people like the Underground Railroad from being detained. And I think it's about making your government being truly about a sanctuary location, which means you actually have to confront the structure. So even though it's a good thing that certain places have put forward whatever sanctuary laws they have, they're only doing it within the confines of what the law allows them to do. And if you're the local level, as we found out, if the state level wants to revoke that, or the federal wants to impose its will, it can, because of the way that government is ordered today. So the sanctuary city is just like the factory farms, which is just like the sewage sludge, which is just like all those other things, which is the system wants to deny us this ability to protect or advance rights on the way that that legal doctrine, that box operates, and it's about getting out of that box.
So it's like, I know Dream of Growing Fire Hose, but just one last point that we want to get out, which is that this concept that we as people have a constitutional right to govern ourselves within our communities. So again, you don't hear that often, but that we the people, that people living here in, for those of you who live in Spokane, that the people of the city of Spokane have an inherent constitutional right to govern their own community. That is foreign to jurisprudence for the last 200 years in this country. That concept is foreign. It has been overridden, it's been nullified, it doesn't exist anymore. We're trying to resuscitate that. And in a fashion or a lens in which that right of local community self-government, that constitutional right, is used to expand and broaden rights. So using the municipal base as a way to expand and broaden civil, political, and environmental rights. So that we, the people within our communities, if we want to do this work to expand and broaden rights, that we have a right to do so that can't be overridden, can't be overturned, can't be nullified. That may sound radical, right? That somehow we can exempt ourselves from certain kinds of preemption, from the operation of corporate rights, from Dillon's rules, these other doctrines that you guys have been talking about. It's not so radical in one respect. That relationship already exists between the federal and the state government today, and has existed in the United States for the past 100 years, which is that your state constitutions can broaden and expand federally guaranteed constitutional rights. Your Washington Constitution can go beyond the scope of federal constitutional rights that are guaranteed. The Washington State Constitution could contain Fourth Amendment protections that are broader than federal constitutional Fourth Amendment protections, or broader protections for criminal defendants, or broader First Amendment free speech rights. This is the law in the United States today, that federal and state relationship, that people within the state can actually broaden and expand out those constitutional rights that exist at the federal level. What we're saying is that this relationship should also define the relationship between communities and the federal and state government. That communities, when they expand and broaden constitutional rights or expand and broaden civil, political, and environmental rights, should be able to do so without being interfered with by corporate rights, ceiling preemption, or Dillon's rule. That's the legal doctrine. We just submitted a law review article to Harvard on this concept, this right of local community self-government, which has been developing within us internally for the past 12 years or so. So a legal doctrine that would actually give protection to those municipalities, people within those municipalities, recognizing as an individual constitutional right that we have a right of local community self-government. So that's the concept. When we get dragged into court and the corporation sues one of our communities, our argument to the judge is that the community has a right of local community self-government that cannot be infringed by these other doctrines that you guys have covered during the democracy school. Question?
I think you may have answered this, but I want reassurance. What if we postulate a community of 10,000 that gets together and says, damn it, we don't want any black people living here? I mean, that's sort of the flip side of this.
Yes, which is why we talk about this as a one-way valve. That broadening and expanding means building on the base of federal and state constitutional rights, but not going below the floor. And in the state constitutional amendments that we put forward, it's about establishing a floor of existing statutory protections as well as constitutional rights. So the logic there, of course, is that you, as an individual, are a citizen of 3 different layers of government. You're a citizen of your municipality, you're a citizen of your state, and you're a citizen of the United States. Each of those layers carries with it different rights protections. And the lower level can't violate rights protections that are offered or guaranteed by other levels. So this whole concept of broadening or expanding, building from the floor, basically treating the floor as the lowest common denominator that any of these offer or guarantee or secure, and then building up from that floor. That's the legal theory that we argue in court.
The 28th Amendment you mentioned at the top of one of the other pieces of paper.
Yep.
Do you see that as getting rid of corporate personhood in court as part of it?
We think, getting a little deep, but we think there's 2 rounds of constitutional change. The first round of federal constitutional change needs to be to liberate communities to do that, to redefine corporate rights within their municipalities. So a right of local self-government, which is federally anchored, so that says you have a right of local self-government, which includes the ability to redefine corporate rights in the community. And then the second round is actually doing the substantive amendments to eliminate corporate personhood, eliminate corporate rights, to recognize rights of nature. I mean, all that good stuff is happening in other places. Yeah.
I have so many questions.
So what is the hope to overrun the box?
Well, hold on.
It's a little bit of a personal question, but after so many years working in this, have you developed a benevolent view of corporations because they aren't, because it is the structure that's the enemy?
Yeah.
And do you envision eventually just more consensus and, sort of entrepreneurial type people, working together with communities to,
No. I have to say, I've found some really nasty people working within the corporate form. But I think thinking that the enemy is the corporation is a short-sighted view. It's not the whole picture, because if we stop with that, then the organizing stops there. It doesn't move beyond that. And so I think we have a job to actually lay that path and go beyond that to understand it's a structural problem. That doesn't leave the corporate boys off the hook. Because the corporate boys enjoy those benefits that they get from the state and federal government, and they relish them and they use them aggressively. And so it's not that they're not without fault, but there's a bigger structural problem that we have.
And is there any effort to do these sorts of workshops for legislators, professionals? Any special outreach?
No, but we have legislators in classes. We have legislators, we have municipal attorneys, we have environmental lawyers, we have community activists. I mean, the whole thing. But legislators generally, they're in the same boat, which is that they'll come up to you afterwards and say, I could introduce something, but it's not going to go anywhere because of the power and influence exercised by X, Y, and Z. So, yeah. Other questions, Steve?
So the way the system works now is the municipalities have power only what the state gives them.
Correct.
And you're trying to turn that around, that the state, that the municipalities are going to start at that point and kind of move the states to support them.
Yes, the only caveat I would say is that we don't talk about municipal rights, that the rights attached to the municipal corporation. We talk about individual constitutional rights that we have, and we act collectively to make law. And so it's a
Do
little
we have
different.
that individually?
Well, that's what we're saying, that's what this right is. So we're arguing in courts that we have a constitutional right to act collectively to make law, to assert that right of local community self-government. And so it's an individual right, constitutional right. It's not a right held by the municipal corporation. So the
And
city
we
is,
have that right under the Constitution to individually.
that's what we're arguing. Yep. Yep.
Now, when this has come up in Spokane the last couple of times, I really struggled to understand it. I was telling Kai, I mean, every time, and it's so complex.
Yep.
And to really, as you say, get down in the weeds and get it has required a phenomenal effort by 3 smart people today, and all of us dedicating this much time. How can you possibly, how do you even begin to really do a sea change when if it does in fact require that amount of effort to get true understanding, so the pick and shovel work is done not just by you guys, but by a greater group of people?
Can I say something about
Yeah.
that? Can you pick me up on the mic? Is that okay? In 2009, we ran the first Community Bill of Rights, and for those who were here and paying attention, we lost 3-1, 75-25%. And we were told by people who supported us and people who opposed us, okay, you learned your lesson, you tried, good job, pat on the head, go away. We were outraised, I think, $500,000 to about $100,000. And there's no denying that there was massive disappointment. I don't think any of us expected that we would win the first time. But in the aftermath of kind of assessing and regrouping and reorienting, how do we keep the work going forward? Because all of us at the time were committed to a structural approach that the surface stuff that we addressed last night and today is not a way to win. About a year later, I know Kai and Tom and I and a couple other people were on a conference call with some people in Bellingham because they had seen what we did and they wanted to initiate an effort there. And that was the same night that the Community Bill of Rights passed in Pittsburgh. And Pittsburgh wrote theirs based on what happened in Spokane. And the communities that are working in Oregon, where Kai's working in Oregon on pesticide spraying and GMOs, began their work because of what happened in Pennsylvania and Spokane and Pittsburgh. And so what Tom described as if somebody does it, then maybe somebody else will, and then maybe somebody else will. It isn't happening with the speed with which we hoped, but it is happening. And so, when you're talking to 15 to 20 people at a time, you're right. How do you make a sea change with all of this complicated shit? If you're talking to 15 to 20 people at a time. But what happened in Spokane, in 2009, we lost 75 to 25. In 2011, we lost by 1 percentage point and won more precincts than we lost. And in 2013, we had threatened them so much they sued and kicked it off the ballot. And so, I mean, when you touch the bear, it responds with, as Tom said, it all comes down on you. That happened in Spokane. So that's part of an answer to that question, because we lived it in real time. We're kind of morphing and regrouping in Spokane. We have an initiative filed with the city to stop the coal and oil trains based on a right to climate. It also demands that under the right to local self-government, law enforcement cannot arrest people for nonviolent direct action to stop the coal and oil trains.
That's under that same initiative.
And so we're going to start gathering signatures in about a week or two. We need volunteers to do that. So,
Where do you get your money?
Monsanto. Monsanto.
Burlington, Northern Santa Fe.
No, seriously, how do you get funding for this?
People like you, people like me, people like Kai. I mean, it's people who donate time, people who give $25. Earl's been giving faithfully for the last 5 years, $25 here, $50 here. Sorry to call you out, Earl, but it's ordinary folks just giving to that kind of effort. So,
And there's a reason it's hard. I mean, it's built in that it's hard. It's difficult. We're not supposed to be doing it. I mean, you're trying to turn everything up. You're upending everything. The municipality was never intended to be an independent governing entity. You're trying to make it so. And then you're trying to drive it like a guided torpedo up against those other layers of law. But you don't do it because you choose to do it. It's because there are no other options. We're getting to a point where there's nothing, in the box left.
Well, why are people like, John Snyder, some of those guys who I look to as somebody that I trusted, was a progressive in our city council, and he opposed it.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking, what's going on here?
Progressives and liberals tend to be part of the problem in some
Wait,
ways.
say that again, what?
Progressives and liberals tend to be part of the problem sometimes, which is that the progressive movement came out of the late 1800s, and it was people that embraced the corporate form as inevitable. They were the efficiency expert people, and they gave you the regulatory state. They created the regulatory state. That's the history of the progressives in the United States. There's a reason why we don't work with environmental organizations anymore, because they send everybody into the regulatory system. That's what they do. They've made careers out of it. That's how they make money. That's how they raise money. That's how it happens. I'm to the point where those entities are almost as big a problem as the corporations themselves, because people can see the corporation as an enemy. People think they're allies or not. And we have this fake understanding of who allies are. So we sat down with John a number of times, he just couldn't hear it. I mean, there's a big difference between people like Ben Stuckert, who think, let's do whatever we can within the existing system and do the best we can within it, versus let's crash it and actually use our municipality to drive something different. It was Stuckert that pulled the initiative off the ballot this past year, 2016, on the coal and oil trains, because he said, we're preempted. He actually became an enforcement arm for the very corporate law that had been put in place for the first place to preempt the passage of the law. What needs to happen is people like Ben have to understand that you got to push outside of that box. You actually have to work outside the box. It's the only thing that's real anymore, because the box itself is closing in. I mean, even people that I would not have expected to have seen that before are now starting to talk about it, but the box is getting smaller. The box will allow remedies so that people can more clearly see how small the box is getting and the need to go outside. But Spokane has never really been a bastion of real radical, well, it was at one time, back with the Wobblies but today the progressives on the city council, they're not, they don't understand this stuff, they're not in that place, and so what you get is a lot of people who are not supportive of what comes forward.
And just to answer another part of your, like, how do you build this? So kind of the scaffolding being created are these community rights networks at the state level, which are being made up of the communities doing this work in other states. So Oregon, Colorado, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, Ohio. So it's about communities who've had their local level fights, understanding it's not fracking, it's not the pipeline, it's not the GMOs, it's pesticides, it's the structure. And so regardless of the issue that got us to fight for our own community, let's link arms now and begin to move towards that state level. And so it is very difficult to do, as you described, this work because of how complex it is. So what's beginning to happen now is the work we're trying to do as an organization is to empower the people in those places and in those states to begin doing the same kind of work that you're being exposed to here today, so that there's more numbers. But it's been taking a while to just build the numbers, and it's going to take a while longer to get enough numbers, so that it's not just 3 people, but it's, you know, a couple hundred people out there doing similar kinds of democracy schools in the places where people live, so that more people are exposed to it and the mobilization and the movement can build. So just like the Freedom Riders and the Lane Seminary abolitionists going around talking about it, it's the same kind of thing that has to happen, but understanding that we've got to keep the complexity of the frame. And so we're sort of limited right now based on people's awareness and consciousness. And that's also why when Thomas said we need 10,000 communities doing this work, well, the more communities that fight, the more it's going to be, people are going to be exposed to it, the quicker they're going to learn, the less sort of formal education stuff I think is going to be necessary because people will see it more. And it's, again, only when communities confront it. So one community right now, Lafayette, Colorado, put a community bill of rights in to ban fracking. Well, they got sued by the oil and gas industry in their own state, saying, well, you don't have the right of local community self-government to stop fracking. They got taken to court. They lost in court. They've come around now and introduced a new law, a right to a healthy climate, that bans fracking. And basically are standing in the same shoes that, yes, we still have that right, and we're not going to let go of it regardless of what the legal system wants to say against us. So it's about showing up and continuing to show up. Just like other people who had to fight for other rights, they didn't give up because they got knocked down once. They got up and they kept showing up. And just to show that Spokane has not been a failure, even though from a ballot measure standpoint you can maybe say it has been, the whole Community Bill of Rights framework comes out of Spokane. So all these other communities now that have passed Community Bill of Rights have Spokane to thank for that. The right to healthy climate that Lafayette's doing, well, that comes out of Spokane. So Spokane's actually been a trendsetter in getting other communities to pick this work up, even though we've had difficulty with getting the laws adopted here. It hasn't been for naught. It's been recognized, and it's what Thomas said earlier. If we do it, maybe someone else will do it, and if they do it, someone else will do it. And I think that's how movements build. But yeah, you have to have the infrastructure, you got to have the funding, you got to do the educating, but most of all, you have to stand up and do the fighting and do the action, because without that, the exposure doesn't happen. It all kind of happens in silence, and it's maybe a footnote somewhere in a history book at some point.
So we're out of time, but just two hopeful things at the end here. One is that next week we've been invited in to talk to the Chippewa tribe in Minnesota, because the tribes also have constitutions. They have tribal constitutions and lawmaking authority within their reservations within the tribes, and also courts that can begin to control the interpretations of these doctrines. And so we've tried for a while to actually establish those relationships, but now they're being established. So the Ho-Chunk, the Chippewa tribe in Minnesota, different indigenous communities who are now beginning to move with this lawmaking, who have more latitude somewhat than municipal communities have. And the second hopeful thing is that 5 years ago, as a result of some of this lawmaking stuff, Leonardo DiCaprio's filmmakers, known as Tree Media, picked up this stuff and began traveling to different communities to talk to folks who were doing the work. And that resulted in the movie that just came out last year called We the People 2.0, which is in 100 film festivals, and basically was intended as a distillation of this stuff without diluting it, but a distillation and a summary of this material so that it doesn't take 9 hours for somebody to sit and actually come up to speed on it, but that can be done in a much shorter period of time. Hand up back there. And
I just wondered if you'd done a TED Talk, or if you considered a TED Talk.
we've been invited to do a couple of the TEDx
Thought
stuff.
you did it in 15 minutes.
So yeah, that's part of the problem is, this is all the world's upside down kind of stuff.
So where do we go as a community? I mean,
Yeah, so there's an initiative that has been filed. Brad mentioned it. It's the Right to Climate, dealing with the coal and oil trains. That needs to qualify. Then it's going to draw a court fight if it qualifies, and if it makes the ballot, then there needs to be a campaign. So from a legislative perspective, that's what needs to happen here. And so there needs to be petition circulation, gathers, and all that kind of stuff. The petitions are being printed, or close to being printed, so ready to go, and then qualify by June sometime. Other questions before we break up here? Over here?
Well, in Spokane, there is they're gathering signatures for Safer Spokane.
Right.
So you're aware of that. Okay, so that's two separate initiatives.
Yeah, the initiative that we filed was originally the very first initiative, and then I sat down with my friend Brian. Brian Pegg's on the council, who's the reason why Democracy School is in Spokane, because he brought us over from Seattle. But his model is not our model. He was unwilling to go as far as the Right to Climate stuff in the newly filed initiative. He's stuck back in the regulatory penalty fines stuff on the coal and oil trains.
Okay.
Yeah, so they're two separate things. They're two separate initiatives. And both may not make it to the ballot, depending on the pre-election ballot challenge stuff, or one may and the other one won't. But one is a safety thing, and the other one is a climate thing. Because you can make the trains as safe as you want coming through Spokane, but that doesn't stop the climate change stuff from happening. So the damage still occurs because the coal and oil is being combusted. So it's all about the frame of the problem. So there are two different frames, two different initiatives at this point.
So if it doesn't go through, you just try to do it again, right? Is that the?
As long as it takes, depends on when people
So we
are.
don't have a bill of rights here. So that's the one we didn't pass, right? Is that-
Yeah, there's been 3 attempts with the Community Bill of Rights, there was a Worker Bill of Rights, and now there's the right to climate. You know, it's all been about real issues in the community, but in some ways it's understanding that this work's still building on the issues itself, that people can't really just go on the structure itself because it's not what people can see, so that issue needs to be there, I think, as the entry point at least, to maybe get people to see the deeper structure. And so the right to climate is a means to say, well, we have this right to climate, but it's also understand that we have a structure of law that's denying us this sense of democracy that we think we have.
But whatever the entry point is that you're talking about, bill of rights, worker rights, climate. So, but that will give you the starting point to develop that structure that you're talking about?
The structure is embedded into the ordinance, into the
Okay.
initiative. So when you read the latest initiative, you'll see stuff from Democracy School that you'll recognize. So the toughest question you'll get asked after you leave here is people asking you, what is Democracy School? If you have an answer to that, let me know. I think we have close up.
Yeah, you guys should talk to Annie Leonard.
Yeah, we know Annie.
Story stuff.
Yep.
So we are a couple minutes past. Definitely want to see if there's any other kind of comments, questions, anything that we want to say before we leave here. Before that happens, I want to thank everybody for giving your time. It's been enjoyable. It's fun to be able to teach the school again. Like I said, it's been a while since we've taught one here in Spokane. And we're hoping to have one in May, probably the beginning of May. We're looking to see if those dates will work and try to have these as regular as possible so we can keep funneling more people through in hopes that it's part of what builds things here in Spokane. So that's the goal.
When you teach these democracy schools, is it always the same curriculum that's presented that we were taught tonight, or do you have different sort of levels where you get a little bit deeper or different things are discussed?
Yeah, right now we've been using mainly this curriculum. Definitely if we begin to teach more of these, we could look at sort of the 2.0 version of the school. So as maybe people go through this first school, that we then have a next round of sort of a democracy school for those who kind of get what this exposed to, and I think that's what has to happen. So part of that's happening in other states. They're actually formulating their own state democracy schools that are specific to Oregon or Ohio or Pennsylvania, and sort of actually, again, trying to put those roots down deeper into the soil to make it harder again for the system to take them out.
And one last plug, I guess, if you know other people in other communities across Washington State. I mentioned Bellingham, but that effort got challenged, sidetracked, and then sort of fizzled. So Spokane is really the only place that's tried to move something forward under this model of organizing. So if you know folks that live elsewhere in Washington, where they're confronted by an issue and you want to share with them this framework as a way of organizing, make sure you put them in contact with us so we can build a network across the state.
Excellent presentation.
Thank you.